you said you were in your 40s.
48 I was.
48? Did your performance go up or did you just maintain?
So I actually got...
Today's guest is Dr. George Dallam, who is a former national teams coach for USA Triathlon and worked with elite triathletes, including Olympians, national and age group champions, Pan American Games medalists, world age group champions, and even the world's top-ranked male triathlete in 2005 to 2006, Hunter Kemper.
You know, that's when my brain started to turn away from, I'm just doing this so I don't get sick all the time, into, wow, this is actually making me better at a time when you're not supposed to get better.
He also holds the title of Distinguished Professor in the School of Health Science and Human Movement at Colorado State University, Pueblo, has received numerous awards as a professor, no surprise there, and is now happily retired. It's my pleasure to introduce you, Dr. George Dallam. All right, George, thank you for coming.
Absolutely, my pleasure, Clint.
One of the things that we're going to be talking about didn't seem compelling to me, but when I read your book, you made a pretty good argument for how it can give you a lift in performance. So to set the stage, can you talk about the 800-meter runner who broke the world record in 2012, and what did you notice about him?
Sure. David Rudisha, who is a Kenyan athlete, Maasai warrior, actually, very clearly set all of his world records breathing with his mouth completely closed. I became aware of this just off of a Let's Run post where after he'd set the world record, and I'll lose track of this, I think it was maybe 2012, at 1:40.9, I think it was, there was a lot of discussion, is he doped or not, right? I was skeptical about that particularly, but then I noticed this one poster had said, and if he knew how to breathe properly, he could have gone even faster. This guy was, at the time, considered to have created the most magnificent performance in running in the history of the Olympic Games, on par with like Beeman jumping 29 feet when the world record was like 27.7 in the Mexico City Olympics. So, you know, I took a close look at the video around this, and I found a video of him not from that Games where they closed in on his face, but from a prior setting of that world record where the video came right in on his face through the last maybe 300 or 400 meters, where you would be most needing to ventilate, mouth completely closed. And of course, he's running way in front of these other runners. And so then I spent a little time looking up what I could about him. I found an interview with his coach, which then disappeared again on the internet. I don't know what happened to it. His coach was this man, he wasn't a priest, but a man who worked in a Catholic school in Kenya who coached a lot of Kenyan athletes. He really used his school as a developmental program for many of the elite athletes from, I can't remember what the first one was, but probably from the 70s forward. And in the interview, he talks about the idea that one of the things that they did was emphasize nasal breathing. So I also have become very aware of the idea that there is some thought process around nasal breathing in the Kenyan athletes, right? That actually might be more of a cultural thing too, that it's more commonly held idea you should just breathe through your nose. So why that's so fascinating is when you run 800 meters, you know, especially when you're running it in like 1:40, you're achieving levels of ventilation that almost no other human is probably capable of. If you remember, or if you know anything about David Rudisha, he's a pretty big guy. And his ventilatory rate was probably over 200 liters. I don't know that anyone's ever done a VO2 max on him, but in 800 meters to reach 200 liters of ventilation through the mouth, to be able to achieve an adequate amount of ventilation through the nose says, wow, we need to rethink the idea of whether this concept that breathing through our nose limits ventilation actually limits our ability to oxygenate our muscles, whether that's actually valid or not, right? Because how could he do that otherwise? So there are other examples of that. I won't say her name correctly. It's a Ethiopian name. I believe she's Ethiopian. Lieutenant Sinabet Gide, who at one point held the world record from like 1,500 meters up through half marathon. And at one point was considered potentially the most dominant female distance runner. She has her lips pursed slightly when she runs, but she's clearly breathing nasally as well, right? So then if you start looking at people who are creating the best performances in the world, in history, in events that require the highest rates of ventilation, and running requires probably a higher rate of ventilation than anything else. We used to think it was cross-country skiing, but the evidence now would suggest it's running, which makes sense, as running is built into us. You know, this idea that somehow you shouldn't do this because you're not going to be able to ventilate enough, it seems like we had to investigate it again, right? Not to say that those few examples prove the case. They're what we'd call inductive evidence, or leads us to inductive logic. Why are they doing that? Should the rest of us be thinking about doing that? But it does sort of remove the argument that most people have, that it would be ridiculous to think that an elite athlete could breathe through their nose and be able to perform a high level of aerobic work requiring a high level of ventilation. Clearly it's not, right? Some of the great athletes in history have actually done that.
Okay, so that being said, you made a case study on a triathlete who said that he could breathe through his nose in all his paces, not just the slow ones, but even in his fast paces.
Yes.
So what experiment did you conduct with him? What were the metrics that you measured, and what did you find out?
So what we were really interested in was, could he produce the same VO2 max breathing nasally that he could produce orally? So the argument would be, well, you can adapt to nasal breathing, but you'll never be able to work to really high levels of ventilation where you achieve your highest level of oxygen consumption. And so we basically just did a VO2 max test in the nasal condition and in the oral condition. And what we were able to find was that he was able to produce basically the same VO2 in his nasal breathing condition and work just as hard in his nasal breathing condition, achieve the same point in what we would call the protocol. So in a VO2 max test, customarily what we do is what's called a graded exercise test, where we ramp you up in levels of work. Typically, we'll do that in 3-minute levels of work, but sometimes we do it in very short ramping, like 30-second levels of work, because we're not interested in how hard you're working at any stage. We just want to see what's at the end, right? So that's what we actually did in this particular study. And he was able to produce the same work breathing nasally as orally, even though his ventilation was still lower breathing nasally than orally, which goes to the idea that it isn't really ventilation that was determining his oxygenation, it's something more than that. So what becomes really interesting about this is just how much more efficient nasal breathing is, right? That even though we won't achieve as much ventilation when we breathe through our nose, and no one would argue about that anywhere in the physiological sciences world or in practical application, but our body has ways to still achieve the oxygenation, right? To still extract enough oxygen from this smaller amount of breathing, smaller amount of air that we're actually, moving through our lungs over and over again. In a way which then can allow us to oxygenate our muscles. And you could even suggest, this isn't definitively proven yet, but you could even suggest that it might allow us to oxygenate the skeletal muscles, the brain, the heart a little bit better than we do when we breathe orally, especially at very high rates of work. So the last paper we published before I retired here recently goes to that idea, right? This idea of actually improving oxygenation of the brain and the heart. You haven't seen that paper, but I have a section of the book where I wrote about that before we wrote this paper. I'm on what's called ResearchGate, which is kind of the only social media I really do where you're interacting with other researchers. So I can kind of tell from the number of people who are reading the papers whether it's getting interest or not, and the paper is starting to get interest. So, still the original papers we did get the highest volume of interest, but this new paper is also, people are starting to connect to that. And what I hope to do with that paper, because it's not a paper that's a definitive proof of concept. It's more, hey, we've got enough evidence, we should start studying this directly. What I'm hoping is that somebody will see that and say, hey, let's create that study, right? Because I was too old and don't have the right equipment to really look at myocardial blood flow, which is an ultrasound sort of equipment that I don't have in my lab. I have a pretty rudimentary lab. So
can CrossFitters or athletes in anaerobic sports be able to use this?
So we do have some evidence around the idea of an isolated anaerobic effort, right? So one of my students went to UNLV to do his master's degree, and he did the study that a lot of people cite, looking at nasal breathing at aerobic levels of work. But then later on, somebody else in his program did a study where they looked at what's called a wind gate test. So you may be familiar with that. That's the one where you get on the bike and you go as hard as you can for 30 seconds, right? We set a certain load based on your body size and you just go all out. So we're looking at what's called short anaerobic and long anaerobic performance in that kind of test. And so, they basically found that whether you breathe nasally or orally had no impact. So actually that's very commonsensical, right? Because those tests are purely anaerobic. They rely very heavily on anaerobic energy systems because they're so short that your body hasn't ramped up its ability to provide oxygen rapidly enough to provide a huge contribution. And so, it probably doesn't matter how you breathe. You can almost make the argument that what might matter there would be how well you're stabilizing your core because you're working so hard. So there is a body of research on that too, done by this young man over in Eastern Europe. I've actually worked with him on his last paper, which should come out here fairly soon, where he looks at the idea of different iterations of breathing on like bench press performance, squat performance, things like that. So, really, we don't expect there to be a benefit for short anaerobic things. Now, CrossFit is an endurance sport, right? It isn't a short anaerobic sport. It's like cycling is an endurance sport, or water polo is an endurance sport. It's a series of hard efforts separated by, steady movement, right? So, you think about the way a water polo game works. You go really hard, try to get position, score, and then you go as slow as you can to get back and, try to recover. Soccer works the same way. Basketball works the same way. CrossFit is basically that. Go really hard, but then get to the next station, get to the next task, with some elements of pure endurance work, like when they do a separate, say, swim or run, if that comes up in the list of sports they're going to do for the big events, the ones that I've seen on TV. From that perspective, no one has studied that idea of how well will you do in a sport that escalates up and down in intensity over and over again. I suspect it would be advantageous in the same way it would be if you were going to go and run 15 kilometers in a race or run a marathon in a race. We don't yet know that you'll run faster scientifically. What we can pretty well establish is that you'll run more economically. So that's a complicated idea, right? That means that when I perform an activity that requires me to produce oxygen and utilize oxygen, intake oxygen and utilize oxygen, economy refers to how much oxygen I need. So if I can do that using less oxygen, that means less energy is going to that. Less blood flow is going to that. That means more energy, more blood flow, more oxygen can go to my working muscles, which usually means I can then work a little harder, right? So our study looked at that idea very directly by comparing our study that looked at people who were already adapted to breathing nasally, by comparing at steady state, meaning running at a constant effort over, I believe we took 6 minutes a day over about a 10-minute test, looking at your oxygen consumption. We showed that during the nasal breathing trial, right, running at that same hard pace, actually we used less oxygen, even though you weren't generating any more energy anaerobically. Your lactate level wasn't any higher, your effort wasn't any higher. And that suggests a possible avenue for the small anecdotal performance improvements that we hear about and that I've experienced, because I adapted to doing this almost 20 years ago now, and that I've seen in other people who have adapted to it. They see small gains in performance comparable to the idea of how you improve economy by getting stronger if you're a runner. Years ago, we used to not let runners strength train at all because we thought add muscle mass, they'll run slower, because you have to carry your body weight. But nowadays, we understand that if we can get you stronger in that movement pattern of running, that it requires you less energy to run at the same pace, and that improves your performance. And that's now definitively, like many, many meta-analysis, many, many review papers, definitively proven. So the exact same thing would apply in CrossFit, right? Our mechanism that might produce economy is that you don't have to breathe as much. So breathing, people don't realize this. They think of breathing as something like magical, right? But breathing actually is just a muscular effort. It's just your diaphragm contracting over and over again, your intercostals contracting over and over again. When you're breathing heavily, almost all the muscles in your upper body contracting to facilitate that movement of air in and out of the lung. So that takes a lot of energy. We talk about at VO2 max, that might even approach 15% of all the energy you're expending is just going to you breathing. So if you can reduce how much breathing you have to do, right, meaning your breathing has now become more efficient, that's more energy left over to go elsewhere. That would apply whether I'm running a marathon or whether I'm in a CrossFit competition.
Does that mean, so theoretically, if you get really efficient with nasal breathing, right, and then you actually have to hit on the gas pedal and then you use your mouth at that point, will that kick you up into higher gear?
So if you were to go to your mouth, you would lose some of that efficiency almost immediately, right? To achieve a similar oxygenation, and this is where it gets sort of complicated, you have to increase your ventilation a lot when you go to your mouth, right? So what you're really rectifying when you go to breathing through your mouth is dealing with the amount of CO2 in your blood, right? So that's the main driver of our, what we call air hunger or sensation need to breathe. It's also the main driver of our breathing itself, what we call respiratory drive, right? So, there's going to be a point in almost anybody, unless they set out to adapt to breathing nasally at every level of work, where they'll start to get a high enough level of CO2 that they start feeling like they're not getting enough air, and the stimulus will be to open your mouth because that efficiently increases ventilation. So why is that so important? When we breathe orally, and can breathe really rapidly, that favors removal of CO2 from the blood. That has to do with its binding capacity with hemoglobin, et cetera. It's a little bit complicated, but it favors it to breathe really fast. So our blood levels of CO2 actually start to drop. When we breathe nasally, we breathe much more slowly. That doesn't favor CO2 removal, so our CO2 levels get a little bit higher. So most people look at that and go, well, then that's bad, right? You never want to breathe nasally because your CO2 levels are higher. It's actually really good for you to get used to, not where you can deal with it, but where the sensation goes away, you to get adapted to or used to a little higher level of CO2, because CO2 is one of the most powerful vasodilators in the body. So vasodilation basically means opening of the blood vessel, right? As CO2 circulates through the blood, right, it hits receptors that allow the blood vessels to enlarge slightly, that increases blood flow, and blood flow is how we get oxygen everywhere, right? So one of the things we know happens in this recent paper, we illustrated this from our data, is that when you get past your second ventilatory threshold, or what you might know as the anaerobic threshold, you're ventilating pretty hard all the way up to VO2 max, your blood CO2 levels actually start dropping, which means you're probably compromising circulation both into your muscles as well as into your brain and heart at that point, right? Because you have less of this vasodilator at the point you need it the most, right? And we also know from a long history of studying the effects of breathing, hyperventilating through your mouth versus breathing in a more controlled way through your nose, that at rest when you hyperventilate and that lower level of CO2 starts to occur in your blood, you actually get some vasoconstriction in your myocardial arteries. If you have a person who's susceptible, who has a lot of atherosclerosis, they can rest from that. Essentially, you can produce the conditions for a heart attack from that. So, the physicians have a term for that, which I've lost right in my head at this point. But, it's an arrest that's induced by a panic attack where we start breathing through our mouth really quickly, and then we vasoconstrict the arteries in our heart. And then, again, particularly if our heart is already compromised, if it already has less blood flow than it's optimal, that can create the condition where you get infarction, where ischemia produces an inadequate amount of oxygen getting into the tissue, and the tissue just dies, right? And of course, if an infarction is significant enough, then the heart can stop, what we call arrest, right? So we've known for a long time that we can actually create those kinds of situations simply by manipulating our breathing. We've long in exercise assumed that this hyperventilation we see as you reach really high levels of intensity. And literally, the ventilation will be increasing at one angle, and then it'll start to increase at a much higher angle as we get past our second ventilatory threshold. We've long assumed that was good, right? Because people look at that as the basic way you deal with acidity, the basic way that you clear CO2, and they're right, it does do that. But it also potentially puts us in a dangerous position of vasoconstricting arteries going to our brain, to our heart, et cetera. Nowadays, we have people like me who've done this for, a half century. I'm past the half century of training. I started training when I was 6, and I'm 65 now, right? So 59 years, right? Continuously training my whole life, right? So now we have some data from which to look at what actually happens to people who have trained this way for a long time. And one of the things we're seeing is that, and I'm seeing this in people I've known for a long time, right, who were involved in triathlon, is that their hearts have a lot more fibrosis and damage, and we can't explain that.
What's fibrosis?
Fibrosis is when you form scar tissue. Like if you have a hamstring and you overstretch it and underload, and the fibers become damaged, then they'll form scar tissue. So we'd call that fibrosis. Fibrosis is a term I think used mostly in the heart. So we don't really have a mechanical way to create a damage to the heart muscle. The only way we can create it is biochemically, what's called ischemia, a lack of oxygen, which is what causes the damage that creates a heart attack. So, something is causing ischemia in these endurance athletes, and we've never been able to explain that. So that's what this paper is about. It kind of suggests that maybe the reason that we're seeing this in people like this is because they're breathing orally all the time, and they're creating these conditions in training, particularly when they work really hard, right? When they work at VO2 max, or when they work past their second ventilatory threshold or second lactate threshold, depending on how you look at it, that we're creating these conditions where it's very likely that we're slightly compromising myocardial blood flow, which might create the stimulus for you to getting little patches of fibrosis over time, and eventually your heart becomes more and more damaged. So eventually this results in an inability of the electrical wave to move through your heart, right, properly, because when it hits those bits of fibrosis or scar tissue, those are non-conductive, and that tends to cause the flow of electrons to circulate. Remember, the heart doesn't have nerves in it per se, The electrons actually just flux across the myocardium, right? So, which is why we associate this with arrhythmias. Particularly, you've heard of atrial fibrillation, I'll bet. For a guy my age now, atrial fibrillation is like you're freaked out, right? Especially if we're an endurance athlete for a long time. You're thinking, it's almost like I'm going to get this for sure. The percentages are not that high, but it is a little bit scary. And a lot of well-known athletes recently have gone through cardiovascular surgeries. And of course, if you were aware of this, I've been watching that happen to people I knew over the last 20 years, right? Because of this fibrosis and because they now have electrical firing problems. We don't have any clear data to suggest that they're dying at a higher rate, although there is at least one, very controversial data set that's been interpreted multiple ways. They actually redid their analysis and created a huge amount of arguing around this in the scientific world that suggests that the mortality rate in really highly trained people does drop off a little bit, but we've got some other data sets saying that's not true. So this may not be a thing that's allowing you to live longer, but it is a thing that maybe if we could protect ourselves, prevent it from happening, that might allow us to live without these electrical problems, arrhythmias. As an example, I have a friend here locally who's going through this right now, and it's changed her life, right? She has to do things differently. She has to be very cautious about what she does, even though she was totally, into the idea. I won't mention her name, so don't want to violate her confidentiality.
So that being said, though, I mean, I know there's a condition that you suffered with a long time ago when you started doing triathlon, right?
Yep.
And then you made the switch to nasal breathing and it went away?
In the 80s, I started racing triathlon because I'd been a swimmer and water polo player. And then I was at Texas A&M and they dropped our water polo program. That was some politics, which I won't go into. And then I got to the U of A and they did the same, University of Arizona in Tucson, they did the same thing. So I was kind of left floating, right? I didn't really want to swim there. They were one of the better swim programs in the country, and I was good, but not quite at that level. And I was a good water polo. I wanted to play water polo there, so anyway, that's when I sort of started looking around for things to do and took up triathlon. By about 1983 or 84, particularly 84, I had moved out to Texas. I started experiencing this thing where when I would be in the runs, particularly of races, it was like I was ventilating so fast, almost like panning. And then I would get both stitches and I would get wheezing, right? So wheezing is the sound that our body makes when our bronchi, those big tubes that come down to each lung, when they start to constrict. So my bronchi clearly went into constriction. So I went to a physician at the time. He said, well, at the time we didn't have the concept of exercise-induced bronchoconstriction. We just assumed, physicians assumed you had asthma. So he presumed I had asthma and said, I think you have asthma. Let's put you on theophylline. So they don't even use theophylline anymore because it's sort of a stimulant and creates all kinds of bad effects. But it used to be a maintenance drug for asthma. So I took that for like 2 days and I was like this, right? I was like, I'm not taking that. So I just managed that for the next 15 or 20 years, I understood that the stimuli had to do with air being drier. It had to do sometimes with cold, which is also when the air is often drier. It would have to do potentially with pollutants in the air, things like that. So I did a lot of my hard training indoors to try to avoid that. In races, I quite often just experience this and I would just try to work through it. I basically had an early version of what we now call exercise-induced bronchoconstriction. So if you wanted to think about that simplistically, if breathing air is actually damaging your lung, the body, I believe in body wisdom, right? I usually try to explain it physiologically, but I believe the body tries to figure out how to deal with anything. So the body tries to figure out how to deal with that by constricting your bronchi so you can't breathe as much because you're doing this to yourself, right? So people don't like to say that on the medical side, even though if you read all the review papers on EIB, they're mostly acknowledging this is, self-induced. In fact, this one guy, I won't mention his name either. He got booby-trapped by some guy on a podcast asking about my data, which he'd never even looked at. And then he was like, that can't be right. And, it was like left at that, right? He actually wrote a paper about the idea that endurance athletes, professional endurance athletes or elite endurance athletes suffer this as an occupational hazard. So we see rates of more than 50% in some sports. Cross-country skiing is probably the worst case scenario, right? Particularly over in Norway and places where they do it really, really well. Although our program now is really good too, and so I think we're probably seeing a lot of this in our program as well. where, you know, the majority of the athletes almost seem to have EIB. You can literally hear this. We have this woman, Jessie, can't think of her last name, but she's our number one. It has been for a while. She's won a couple of gold medal, or at least one gold medal in the Olympic Games. She won the big tour that they have, the multi-day stage race once or twice. She's a great skier and clearly like works super hard. But, you know, I watched her, or I listened on this broadcast to her finishing the first year she won that tour, and it was clear she was in massive EIB, right? You could hear the wheezing even on the broadcast. And I'm just thinking, you know, somebody needs to address that, right? So I'm sure they have her on bronchodilators. I think subsequently I've read that she, you know, has done bronchodilator therapy. I believe I've read that. I hope I'm not inaccurate in saying that. But I'm thinking, hey, you know what? Mostly that goes away.
Is that what happened to you?
Yes, that's what happened to me. So many, many years later when I was teaching here, it's now 20 years ago, but it was well after I first developed this. When I started breathing nasally, it just went away. Right? I stopped having those episodes. I don't have episodes of that at all anymore. So why is that? Well, when we breathe nasally, all that conditioning happens. We fully humidify the air. We bring it to body temperature. We remove significant amounts of particulate matter, pollutants, other things that might have gotten in there that could also be doing damage to our lung. And our lung seems to somehow recognize that instantly, right? That this is good quality air, no need to constrict the bronchi. So I have this, I won't say his name either, but a football player I had in class just this last year. So great player for us. I love this kid. He has bad EIB though, right? He's on a bronchodilator and he knew it, right? So we came around to having him run the mile and a quarter mile. I have him do some stuff in their physiology class where we look at how those different distances relate. And he shows up and I'm like, did you take your bronchodilators? No, I'm going to try to do it breathing nasally. So he did this out of the box without attempting to adapt to this at all. And he went and ran a quarter mile probably within a few seconds of what he's capable of. He's a very good runner, right? I'll say that he probably could run 50, at this point, even playing football, probably could run a quarter in 55, 56. He ran like a minute, just breathing nasally. And then he ran his mile also relatively close to what he was capable of. And he went into big time air hunger and pain, you could tell. Right, but he didn't have that significant EIB response. He was like freaked out because he assumed if he ever did that, he would, without his bronchodilator, he would have a big time bronchoconstrictive response and go into almost an emergency episode. He did have a little bit though. We measured what's called his FEV1, his forced expiratory volume before and after, because we're evaluating whether you have EIB when we have you run the mile. And he had a little bit of a drop, but it wasn't a huge drop. But then I said to him, did you take a bunch of big oral breaths as soon as you got in? And absolutely, because he put himself into like significant air hunger. He wasn't adapted yet for this. And then right away took 3 or 4 big breaths. And even that was enough to give him a little bit of a bronchoconstrictive response. I experienced that myself when I first adapted to this. I went and ran the fastest mile in a corporate cup in Pueblo that I had run in 4 or 5 years. And, you know, I was like in my late 40s, right? So I had no business doing that. But I did breathing nasally. And it was the first time I ever actually won the corporate cup event outright. And so I took a couple of big breaths right after I crossed the finish line. So I hadn't pushed myself yet. I'd adapted, but I hadn't ever been in that competitive situation, pushed myself that far. And, right away I was hacking and coughing, all the classic stuff that happens when you've been breathing orally, right? So I don't know if I had an EIB response because I didn't have a way to test it right there at the scene, but I knew that it was bad that I had taken those big breaths orally right at the end.
So obviously you got adapted, right?
Yep.
And it's one thing to get adapted. And you said you were in your 40s.
48 I was.
48?
Actually. Yeah, I think.
At that point, right, if you're a triathlon or even an athlete, you're just at maintenance.
Right.
Did your performance go up or did you just maintain?
So I actually got better. Again, when you're, it wasn't like I was new to triathlon. At 48, I'd already been doing triathlon 20 some years, right? And so the mile is an example. I had been running this corporate cup mile, and I'm a big guy, right? I used to play 2 meters in water polo. So these are good times for a big guy. I was running that corporate cup mile, 6 minutes, 5:45 in that range, right? So I ran a 5:32, right? Breathing nasally the year after the year I adapted to doing this, which was enough to win in that at that time. We have a 20K or 12-mile bike ride we also do in that corporate cup. And I had been doing that generally 30, 31 minutes. I'm also a pretty good cyclist. And I think I rode 29:30 that year, breathing nasally, right? So, that's when my brain started to turn away from, I'm just doing this so I don't get sick all the time, into, wow, this is actually making me better, right? At a time when you're not supposed to get better, right? You're supposed to be fighting off getting slower, right? It's also not like I had started training harder or anything like that. So the one thing that did happen at that time when I spent the year adapting to doing this, 6 months to a year, I also started using a neti pot every day. So I stopped getting sick. The other thing in my history is that from the time I was an age group swimmer, I was chronically sick a lot. Upper respiratory stuff, pneumonia, bronchitis. Once I got up here to altitude, lots of sinus infections too. And I just stopped getting sick through a combination of just using a neti pot every day and breathing nasally during my training. So at the time I thought, well, I'm just training more consistently, right? I'm not losing those gaps you get when you have pneumonia, you have to stop training for 2-3 weeks sometimes. But later on, when we did the study, it started to become apparent that it was maybe something more than that, right? That this isn't just you could train more consistently, you're fighting off infection or dealing with the problems of infection in endurance training more adequately, which again would apply to CrossFit guys too, and women. It also probably is something else, and that's why we kind of set up our study to look at the idea of economy, because we thought maybe this has to do with that, right? And then, bam, it did.
I tried doing this, and it's actually pretty hard. How long does it take to adapt to it?
Okay, so adaptation probably has two pieces. The first piece, the most obvious one, is that your receptors for CO2 have to start seeing this higher level of CO2 consistently, and then they stop responding to it the same way. That's called down regulation. The way I always explain this to my students is like alcohol or anything else that causes an effect in the body. The first time you drank a beer, and you're however old you are when you first drink a beer, you get a little bit drunk, right? But then fairly quickly you start realizing, I won't get drunk from that, I have to drink more, because what's happening is that alcohol is altering the activity of the receptors that respond to it. So that's true of caffeine, anything basically biochemically in the body works that way. If you start seeing higher levels of it, the receptors down-regulate their response. So that goes on with CO2, right? If we start regularly exposing our receptors to higher levels of CO2 in the blood, they stop responding to it. So it's not like you have to get used to feeling air hunger, it just goes away gradually. So that's one of the mechanisms. Maybe as important a mechanism is the idea that, when we breathe nasally, we breathe differently, right? So when we breathe orally, the resistance is about half of what it is when we breathe nasally, because we don't have to drag the air through all that turbinates, all the apparatus we have in our nasal cavity that causes the air to swirl around. That all creates drag, not to mention a couple of fairly narrow valves that the air has to get through as well. All that makes it harder to pull the air in, literally twice as hard to pull in air nasally as orally, which means that it activates our diaphragm. So this concept isn't that hard to understand. That's a little bit like if you were riding a bike and about power or rate of work, right? And say you were riding at 200 watts and you decided, I'm going to use a smaller gear to create that same power. You have to turn the pedals quicker, but the forces are lower for each pedal stroke, right? Well, in the same direction, if you decide to use a bigger gear, the forces get higher. So at first, your muscles will fatigue really quickly that way, right? That's why we teach cyclists, by the way, to use smaller gears so that their muscles don't fatigue. They use their slow twitch fibers more. But to go faster, they have to learn to use bigger gears and recruit more fibers because the forces for each pedal stroke are higher. So at first your muscles fatigue, but then they start adapting to that, right? And before you know it, now you can start to turn that bigger gear ideally faster and faster. Well, when we start using our diaphragm during the stress of exercise, instead of immediately defaulting to this low force route where we don't have to use the diaphragm as much, our diaphragm has to adapt to that, right? It just has to go through skeletal muscle change. So, probably we're getting a significant increase in the amount of air we can move nasally through the diaphragm, also through some smaller muscle stuff that's happening in the nasal passage itself, particularly the muscles that flare the nostrils and allow you to open the nostrils a little bit more. They become better trained as well. All that probably gives us a little bit of increase in ventilation, and we're also adapting to this higher level of CO2 and down regulating. So it took me somewhere between 6 months and a year, because I didn't just slow everything down and do it all breathing nasally. I kind of did just a little bit, beginnings of my warm-up, and then gradually added it as I could do more and more. But what I think probably works way better is for people just to slow way down and do all of their work breathing nasally, and then get a much bigger stimulus, and then gradually they'll find they can ramp the work up again, and then they'll find they can get back to the work they did originally, breathing orally, and probably be able to even exceed that a little bit because of that efficiency, that economy kind of idea. That last piece is only anecdotal, although I've seen it so many times. To me, it's factual. It's not anecdotal like I've seen it once. I've seen this in a lot of people, in myself, and I've experienced it in myself. But we don't have a study yet. My study didn't look at the outcome of that economy. It just looked at the occurrence of that economy in a steady state trial. We didn't actually have them run a race or a time trial or something like that. So I'm hoping that's another thing that somebody will do.
It's also hard to do a 6 month to a year study.
So I have this guy I talked to who's also Joe, what is Joe's last name? He does a podcast for older athletes and things like that. And he's actively been doing this for a few years. But he's really struggling to find that, what they call that third gear, that ability to actually do this at high rates of work. So, the tactic that I used and that we now utilize with people who want to fully adapt to breathing nasally is interval training, right? So, most people who are fit, like let's say had an endurance cyclist, right? They can probably go to what's called their aerobic threshold breathing nasally without even actively trying because they already have a little elevated CO2 tolerance. But then to go to higher levels of work, what they have to do is break that work down a little bit into a shorter time frame, find something that they can do nasally, recover, and before you know it, they start being able to do that work more continuously, and you keep using that progression all the way up to doing VO2 max intervals. But initially, you have to do them breathing nasally. You can't just force your way up there. That's why we invented, people think of interval training the wrong way, and our textbooks all teach it in the wrong way. They talk about it as just these really hard efforts. Interval training is a much more refined concept. It's the idea that there's a given rate of work you can do. And if you want to increase that rate of work, the best way to do that is to take that new rate of work and break it into pieces that are still manageable for you. Recover between and let your body adapt to doing that work. And then before you know it, those pieces can get longer and get meshed together and you can adapt successfully to move forward. And you can do that whether you're trying to increase your work aerobically, whether you're trying to increase your work at VO2 max. Elite coaches even do that in 100-meter all-out efforts, right? They break it, intervalize it, right? So that you can produce that slightly higher power that will let you run, instead of running 10-2, let you run maybe 9-9 or 10 flat. So when we do that, what's amazing about it is the effort to do that harder work is greatly reduced if you structure the interval properly, if you don't overdo the interval. So let's say I'm running a mile, and we'll use an easy number, say 6 minutes, right? So that means I can run a quarter in a minute 30 at that pace, right? So if I take a person who can currently run a mile in 6 minutes, and I have them just run quarter miles, and I have them only run about 128 or 129, not the 115 they could run if I give them a lot of rest, just 128 or 129, that's actually fairly easy for them to do. Right, because when they're running at that 6 minute pace, it doesn't feel really hard until they're 3, 4, or 5 minutes into that effort, right? So for a minute and a half, they don't get acidic. They don't really feel that effort as much. They're still running fast. And what they're doing is teaching their brain, their nervous system, that they can actually do this slightly higher level work. And if you track that, right, if you say, okay, this week we ran these at 128, your heart rate was here, and we come back to that 10 days later, and now you're running at 127, you still got the same heart rate, or maybe 128, your heart rate's really low. You're adapting to it. It never actually gets hard to do that training set, right? It's running fast, but it's not hard to do that training set, and you just adapt more successfully. So we just apply the same thing to nasal breathing, right? Like if we'd gotten you to the point where you could say, in our ramping tests, get to your aerobic threshold, then the next step we might do is go a little faster than that and say, let's do like 3-minute efforts here. And if those made you feel significant air hunger and you struggle to be able to continue nasal breathing during recovery, we make them shorter, maybe a minute effort here. And then before you know it, you'd be able to go a little longer and a little longer. So the thing is, you have to keep following that process all the way up to your VO2 max, to your highest rates of ventilation. Right, and if you do that, you can do this at any level of ventilation, as is illustrated by myself. It's illustrated by, more effectively by somebody like David Rudisha. Right, he clearly had spent time in his training breathing nasally at every level of work, including the levels of work he needed to run that, and he clearly had intent to do this. And the amazing thing to me is he didn't even wear a nasal dilator. He did this with just breathing nasally without any assistance that I could see.
There's another benefit that I'm actually curious about that you mentioned, which is it reduces your dehydration.
Yes. So let me say one thing before I go into that idea. There's what we call a myriad of benefits. And so let's think about that. You drive cars, right? And you're old enough to know cars have air filters, right? And you know that if you take that air filter out, you can flush a little more air through the car, and you can get a little bit more, let's call it wattage, or a little more horsepower out of it. But you don't do that. How come?
Yeah, you're going to ruin the engine.
Because you're going to ruin the engine, right? So the human body, it's the same, right? We can force a little more work if we stop using our filtration system, because we can flush a little more air, we can flush more CO2 out. But it's not a great idea, right? Because over time, that damages us. So there's a myriad, a whole bunch of different ways that this affects our physiology. It's actually like a fascinating concept, which is why I went past just being interested in this one single concept. Could I adapt to it, to like all the things that it can do to benefit you? So one of those things has to do with hydration, right? So, you've probably gone out running in the winter, breathing through your mouth, and you see those big, all that air, right? All that water vapor. So if you were to go out and do that breathing nasally, you would see far less of that water vapor, because it turns out that when you breathe in, you add water to the air so that it hits the lung fully humidified. It's 100% saturated with water by the time it hits the lung. But as it leaves and you exhale nasally, you also remove that water, right? So what happens is you don't exhale as much water vapor breathing through your nose as through your mouth, which means you're retaining more water vapor. So there's only one study on this that I'm aware of looking at that directly, and that was at rest, and they showed, I think, 42 is sticking in my head. I think that you retain 42% more water breathing nasally than ordinary, something like that.
That's actually a big deal.
It is a big deal, right? That concept of, maximizing the ability to not dehydrate is very useful, because you can't always have water. Right, in the racing we do, getting water into you is actually a limitation sometimes. Now we have all these drinking systems, et cetera, but then things like that happen, right, where you can't get water. But, in the real world, sometimes people don't have water just because they haven't planned properly, et cetera. So absolutely, that's a big deal.
I mean, the people who try to do nasal breathing, what's the biggest mistake that they usually make?
The thing I see over and over again, I've seen this actually from reviewers of scientific papers, I've seen this from athletes, I've seen this from, is they presume that if you suggest that nasal breathing is good, they don't really want to know why or how or that you have to adapt. They just want to go do it, right? So, this has always been true in humans. We're relatively impatient, right? We want the thing to happen immediately for us. We don't necessarily want to have to understand much. We just want to do it, right? It's what we're talking about, instant
gratification.
Instant gratification, right? And that's getting worse, I think, and that's an old man view. That just describe that to me being a boomer and say, hey, boomer, who cares? But it is a problem, right, in my estimation. So what happens over and over again is you'll try to explain it to them, but they're not really getting that. They're just saying, okay, nasal breathing, good, I'm going to go try it. And then they go out and try to run the same way that they always run, right? But initially, you haven't adapted to breathing this way because you've been breathing orally. So, of course, you're not ready to produce enough ventilation breathing nasally. You feel air hunger. You mentioned yourself, this is really hard for me. Well, all that says to me is you need to go slower, not that it's hard. You just have to find the right pace. But people don't want to do that, right? They want to get there. So they go out and try to run as fast as they can. They feel horrible air hunger. Now, if I was to tell you probably the scariest thing in the world, I'm guessing that one of the categories that would scare you more than anything else, because this is being a human being, is if I held you underwater. Because at some point you'd start to feel air hunger, and you'd start to realize if he doesn't release me, I'm not going to live, right? I'm going to die relatively quickly. So nothing will scare us more than that idea of losing our ability to sense that we're not getting enough air. So what we're really suggesting people do, or what I'm suggesting people so often do, is in not understanding this and just saying, okay, nasal breathing, I'll try it. They go out and they feel air hunger while they're running. And I did that too, right? When I first started doing this, I remember, it'd start out really slow, and then I'd start moving up to my normal road pace, and I'd be like feeling suffocation, right? And that's not easy to overcome. I mean, a rational human being, I don't necessarily always put myself in that category, can't overcome that, right? They're like, that's idiotic. It's like, are you going to overcome having somebody have control to hold you underwater on a regular basis? Hell no. You're going to say, no, that's insane. So, right away, and again, this is not just the neophyte. This is not just the athlete who wants to get there too quick. this is even scientists, right? I still get this, right? Well, I remember a reviewer said to me once, I tried that. You can't do that. I'm like, did you? Like the first time? Of course not. So how do you overcome that? So the basic idea you have to recognize is that you want to find the level where you begin to have a sense that something's different, but not where it's uncomfortable, right? So the way we suggest doing that is to get on, like, let's say you're a runner, right, or a CrossFitter. Get on a treadmill and start walking, breathing nasally. Put some water in your mouth or put some tape over just so you're breathing nasally. And then, go at least 2 or 3 minutes at an easy pace, and then just start increasing that in small increments, right? And keep sensing this idea of, do I feel like I'm not getting enough air? When you first get to the stage, not where it's uncomfortable, but where you start to notice something, that's maybe where your training stimulus should be. So it's not unduly uncomfortable, right? And then before you know it, you'll be going faster and faster and faster. We had a woman who ran for us in cross country, and she had what's called EILO, but initially we thought maybe she had EIB, so I was trying to get her to breathe nasally. She was a woman who could run a mile in, around 5 minutes, D2, pretty good D2 capability. Like in the RMAX, she would win races, but not at D1. And, probably 18, 19 minutes, 5K, kind of like that. So, initially she could hardly run her, warm-up paces, but within like 5 or 6 weeks, because I got her to slow down a lot, she was already to like a 6:30 pace, breathing nasally. Now, it turned out she had this other form of EIB, which has to be dealt with differently, and finally that got figured out, and so she went that route. So we didn't continue with the nasal breathing thing, but she was able to adapt pretty successfully fairly quickly. But it's still not a thing that happens overnight, right? We're talking, even if you did it well, we're still talking probably months if you wanted to get to the point of being able to do really high-level work breathing nasally. And then doing it intelligently, right? Figuring out what the right level is for now, and also how to intervalize the level that you want to get to. So let's say we had you on the treadmill and you got to like a 9-minute pace, 9 minute per mile pace, and you were, starting to feel a little discomfort. Then what we might do is have you mostly run just a little slower than that or right around that pace, but we might also throw in some intervals at like an 8:45 pace where you go for like 2 minutes, right? And before you know it, those would get easier. And so we keep advancing you. It's really just the same way that we advance your fitness, because it's really the same thing, right? We're talking about training skeletal muscles and improving your ability to oxygenate, right? The same thing that we're generally doing.
Yeah, it's the idea of just, you're training to adapt, right? You're not training to destroy your body thinking, oh, I'm going to have to be like at the red line all the time.
Exactly. Well, let's just say we were talking about training your bench press, right? If I train you in failure sets every day, you know what happens. You fall apart, right? I don't know where you are on failure sets, but we could talk about that. So I don't do that, right? I know how often to give you that stimulus, and I try not to increase the stimulus. If I really understand training, I try not to increase stimulus until it's apparent you've adapted. It's gotten easier. I can hit another rep without that fatigue, right? Then it's time to maybe progress the stimulus, right? So all we're talking about when we talk about adapting to breathing nasally is another exercise adaptation. You just do the same thing. You apply the same principles, right? You're adapting your respiratory muscles to be able to do this work of breathing nasally, and they will. But you have to patiently go through that process. So you don't get to be a good CrossFitter in, 15 minutes or even a year. If you listen to what we would say on the elite athlete physiology side, we'd say it's an 8 to 10 year window if you're training intelligently, adaptively, to reach your peak performance. And you probably know that, right? Because when you get those people you got the pictures of, they're probably people who spent 6, 8, 10 years and reached their level, right? Where maybe they're a pro or they're elite age group or something. That doesn't happen in a year. All that happens in a year is a lot of improvement, but you don't get to. So this is the same thing. You have to patiently adapt your ability to breathe this way. It doesn't take 8 to 10 years. I think you could catch up with your skeletal muscles in maybe a year if you, at the outside, it may be as little as 6 or 8 weeks, depending on what your current conditions are around that. I had a friend down in Pueblo who was in our study. He's in karate. He's a very good runner and cyclist, the best of his age down there. But he was also in karate, which means sparring, and mouthpiece. In the old days, mouthpieces, you couldn't breathe through your mouth. And he adapted very quickly. He was running really good half marathon times, breathing nasally within 6 weeks of starting it up, because he already had a very low chemo sensitivity, probably from the fact that he was sparring with his mouth closed, right? So,
What do you mean chemo sensitivity?
So chemosensitivity refers to our sensitivity to chemicals in the blood, to substances in the blood. CO2 is what we're referring to specifically here. It's called the chemo reflex. So, if your CO2 level begins to gradually rise, at some point your brain starts going, wow, you got to breathe faster, right? So chemosensitivity means how soon does that happen, right? So if my CO2 only needs to rise a little bit, I'm very chemosensitive. But if it can rise quite a bit without me sensing that, I'm less chemosensitive. So while we need chemosensitivity, right, that's how we regulate our breathing, to be a little less sensitive is actually beneficial to our health. Here would be an example. So I might stand up in front of a class, and I'm used to being in front of a class. It doesn't make me very anxious. I probably don't increase my metabolism that much, other than the fact that I'm passionate, like how I'm talking to you here is how I talk in class. But I don't notice it, right? But let's say somebody says, Dr. Dallam, your pants are down around your knees and you're, whatever, right? Something embarrassing, and your metabolism elevates because you get all sympathetically activated. At some point, you start realizing that, and then you're even more anxious, right? Because you sense that things are wrong, right? So if you have less chemosensitivity, it takes more for that to happen, right? Meaning that you're going to buffer stress better. Your body's not going to overreact to it. And I actually think that's true about altitude as well. Right, when we go up to altitude, we start to breathe more rapidly because of the change in CO2 levels that we're experiencing. And we start to overventilate at altitude, which leads us down the road of AMS and other kinds of problems. But what we suspect is actually true is if you have a very high chemosensitivity, you've been breathing nasally, that you actually deal with that better. And this is not hypothetical at all. I was involved in a study at UNM around this topic, and then which was lab-based in our chamber down there when I was doing my PhD. And by the way, I was actually running the data, right? I was the one actually collecting measurements. So it wasn't like, I was seeing this peripherally. I watched this happen. And then that study, a follow-up study was done with actual Sherpas and other people in real-world conditions in the mountains. And they all supported the idea that these yogic breathing tactics, where we get very low chemosensitivity, we learn to breathe very slowly, actually help people respond at least acutely better at altitude, meaning they can go up to altitude and deal with it better. I would argue one of the best strategies you could use if you're a mountaineer or a trail runner who goes up to altitude is breathing nasally, because you'll deal with those changes in altitude more successfully. You won't go into the hyperventilatory pattern that leads you then to diurese or pee all the time, that leads you down into AMS and even into the more severe problems. So nice. And I base that in some science.
I want to switch gears.
Yep.
Let's talk about endurance in general.
Okay.
So if you get a new athlete, right, what are the battery of tests that you put that person through to learn their skill and fitness level, so that you'll know what kind of programming, or you'll know the right program to put them through?
So the conventional wisdom there would be to do a VO2 max test, and this is being popularized again, how important VO2 max is, predictive of health, et cetera. And, there's truth in all those things, right? VO2 max is a good measure to sort of look at longevity and things like that. But when I'm dealing with an athlete, what I want to know first is their training tolerance. So there's really two dynamics to the load I'm going to apply, meaning the amount of work I'm going to give them. And one of those is their duration capacity, which I'll just call training tolerance. And one of those is their intensity capacity, which I would translate into how fast are you going to run this interval, et cetera, right? So I want to know those two things. So training tolerance you get mostly from talking to them and from training logs, right? So that could range all the way from somebody who walks in here and has never done any training. But if you don't take the time to figure out what they've been doing and just give them a load, you're making a big mistake, right? Because what you're doing maybe is taking somebody who hasn't trained at all and you're giving them a load that they should be doing 6 months from now. So all you'll do is overtrain them. They'll get hurt, they'll quit, et cetera. And this is true in any training situation, right? You need to start where they're at, not where they want to be. Those are little axioms I like to use to illustrate the principle. Start where you're at, not where you want to be, right? So to find out where you're at, you have to just investigate or find out what it is you've been doing. So you know that in your own head if you're trying to figure something out for yourself. But if you're a coach or a CrossFit instructor, et cetera, you want to find that out first. And then training intensity, we find out through testing. So training intensity means how do I actually respond to the work that I'm being given, right? So I use those two parameters to set up a training program. And that would be true whether I was dealing with somebody who was an adult, came to me because their physician said you need to start an exercise program and get healthier, or whether I'm dealing with an athlete who wants to win a world championship in triathlon. It's still the same idea. I'm going to apply a training load to you. and I don't want to misapply it, right? I want to start out with a training load that's appropriate now, and then we're going to progress that until we reach a point where you no longer are adapting. So how we adapt to increasing training load is a function of all the other variables that influence our recovery, right? Things like sleep and stress, et cetera, workloads, et cetera. So, we don't all universally adapt equally to the same training loads. In fact, we all adapt differently. So the only way to really find out what the right training load is to start low enough with something that you're already doing, and that also makes sense intensity-wise. The testing suggests, hey, you're aerobic here, you're working at your VO2 max here, and then gradually expand that training intensity, tracking improvements in performance until you actually get to the point where this is no longer productive. And then you've kind of figured out for the current circumstances, this is the kind of loading that this person can tolerate. And we're not talking about that over a week or two. That's over months to years to maybe find the training load that's optimal for them. Human beings have a huge variation in this, right? When I ran our national team, and I won't mention names here, but we had one athlete who was, very anaerobic, fast twitch fiber typing, but had found, I'm going to say, their way into triathlon, and had very low training tolerance, right? So benefited really mostly with something less than 15 hours a week, which is nothing in professional triathlon.
That's a lot for us.
Yeah, but for you guys it'd be a lot. But I do that on the bike. Well, not anymore. I'll get up about 12 hours on the bike, right? Just on the bike. I got 3 other things I'm doing too. Anyways, and I wouldn't consider that I am naturally suited to high volume. I had 2 other athletes I worked with briefly, and I won't mention their names either, who were more like 35 hours a week training load, right? So just huge differences, right? Different level of training background and history, what they'd actually previously adapted, different genetics, muscle fiber typing, et cetera. And, you can really mainly find that out just from the history itself, right? You have to talk to the person, because what they've been able to do successfully at least gives you a starting point in terms of the volume, the duration, the total amount, and then what they can do intensity-wise you should test for.
Let's look at an example for someone who has fast twitch muscle. I mean, he can probably deadlift 455 to 500 pounds, in switching to, let's say, an endurance sport. Maybe just starting him out with 10K, maybe all the way to a half marathon. Is the program different for that person compared to someone who has slow twitch muscles?
Well, so the first thing will be their training load in terms of the aerobic work that they do will start out being very, very low, because they won't have experience with that. Even though they're strength trained and we're not too worried about them getting stress fractures, we still can't give them a big training load. So, somebody who's never run at all, you might start out with as little as 5 to 10 minutes of running for the week, right? Now that sounds crazy, and people go, well, that's nothing. I have to do at least 30 minutes. But that's idiotic. That's how they end up quitting. You start them out with a very low load, and you measure, signs that they're adapting. So basically, the most basic way that you can tell you're adapting is that the work simply becomes easier, even if you just sense that subjectively, right? So the second thing is to figure out, well, what speed should they be running at? So if I'm taking a beginner, what I would always teach my students, even if it's your mom you're starting exercise program for, the best thing you could do is put them into a graded exercise test where you start slow enough and then progress it until you find what we call their aerobic threshold. So the guy you mentioned, he's a big advocate of that. This goes back to the theorist Phil Maffetone, and what he had done with Mark Allen. Now it's a very common idea, right? It's now called zone 2 training. It's all the same thing. It's training at the highest rate of work you can do, where you're still balancing the combustion of carbohydrate and fat because you're providing an adequate amount of oxygen. And as you get past that, you start rebalancing to favor a little bit more breakdown of carbohydrate anaerobically, and you start producing more lactate, right? And you get more acidity. So if we can find our way to that aerobic threshold in the beginning, that gives us the easiest route to create training tolerance. So what does that actually mean? So let's say I had somebody who was going to run the mile and they'd never run at all. I could go out and have them run 400-meter efforts on the track, right? I could test them and say, what intensities, right? But they won't respond to that nearly as well as they would if I gradually build up how much running they can just do comfortably. So if I take them from not running at all over a year to maybe running 20 miles a week over a year comfortably, their ability to respond to that real specific hard training around their mile pace, they'll respond to that much better, right? So, that's what I mean by training tolerance. In the sciences, we call this local muscle endurance. Simply the ability to repeat the movement without fatigue. And now what's coming out in elite sort of sport is the idea of fatigue resistance. I actually called that the fatigue rate more than 25 years ago. Finally, they're starting to figure this out, right? That our ability to also resist fatigue over time is actually a hugely important part of a lot of endurance sports. And we have to specifically train for that. So we typically build a platform of that, but then fairly soon we start adding in multiple intensities that target what we'd call the limiters to your performance. Right, your VO2 max is a limiter because it represents a limit in your ability to provide oxygen. Your lactate threshold, first and second lactate thresholds are limiters, right? Your muscle strength is a limiter. The peak muscle power you can achieve is a limiter. Your ability to store glycogen is a limiter. So we create training to overcome those limiters. This is the basic model of training that we've been using in this country since we figured out that the Eastern Europeans and the Russians and the Germans knew more than us. We started figuring out what they were doing and realized we need to take that approach, right? Now that's all been obscured because, of course, we know what happened in Germany. You know, the East Germans were long using roids, and we always knew that in swimming, right? It was very apparent. And the Russians, of course, have also been using anaerobic steroids forever, as well as all kinds of other. So, you know, what's happened there is people have sort of lost sight of the fact that they're also training more intelligently. They weren't just using, ergogenics. They were also training very intelligent. But now that's come into our world. Like you talk to me in the gym about periodizing. Nobody's even understood. That all came out of the Olympic sport, and now we start to see it in more things in the United States. The biggest and most important part of periodization is not the idea of just cycling. It's the idea of what I call complex training, that you hit all the limiters, different training intensities you need to create the best overall effect. So let's say you're a guy who, a typical recreational runner, he's running 5Ks, he runs them like once every couple of weeks, and the rest of the time he runs 3 or 4 days a week and just goes out and runs, right? So how does he run? Well, he's a guy, right? So he's got to, try to hurt himself, try to beat whoever's running with him. So he goes out and runs vaguely hard, right? He doesn't really run slow and easy because that would be wussy. And he doesn't run all out because he doesn't know how to do that. He runs vaguely hard, right? And if one of his buddies comes out with him, they vaguely hard each other until one of them gives up, right? It's males trying to compete with each other. So, those guys improve at first just by running a little bit more, but before you know it, they can't get any better, right? So let's say you take that guy, maybe he's doing 15 miles a week. And all you do is say, okay, let's take one of these runs and let's slow it way down and let's gradually increase how long it is. And let's take another one of these runs and let's have you run right at the pace that we think you can do for 5K, just a little bit faster, intervalized. And let's have you also do a little bit of running where you run at your VO2 max pace, and we'll intervalize it so it's not too uncomfortable, right? And if you do that, this run will start getting better and better and better, even though they won't be running any more than they did before. If you also add in the idea of running more and more aerobically, it'll even bigger platform to get better. But just by creating a complex approach where you hit these different limiters, even in the same training stimulus, they'll start to do way better. And so, that's the most basic understanding of periodization, really. Bomba talked about all kinds of stuff, but the really significant element from my perspective after a lifetime of doing this is the idea of hitting those various training limiters intelligently.
Yeah, that being said, I know it's probably different for a bunch of people, but what kind of training methods do you train? I mean, what kind of training methods do you dose your elite athletes? Because I've heard of polarization.
So now we have a pretty simplified understanding of this scientifically. It's at least advanced, right? We didn't used to understand this at all. And so now we've created these simplified models, right? So polarized training is the idea of doing a lot of what's called zone 1. This is where it gets complicated. Zone 1 is really below aerobic threshold work, including recovery level work. Doing a lot of zone 1, 80%, and then everything else is basically zone 3, fairly high level work above your anaerobic threshold. Nothing in between, right? And so, majority of athletes don't actually do that. They include some zone 2 stuff too. I'm going to talk about what that actually means. So that's in a scientific definition where there's only 3 zones, right? Zone 1, below the aerobic threshold and below. Zone 2, what we call tempo, or in that transition from aerobic threshold to the anaerobic threshold. And then zone 3, anything above anaerobic threshold. However, that's like a very short sight. It's like I'm going to make a salad and I'm going to put 3 things in when I actually have 10 things I can work with, right? It's for people who don't do this for a living, who study it, right? Trying to create models that they can actually use to come up with a conclusion, basically mostly from taking data from people who do it. What we actually do is recognize that every successive increase in the intensity of work represents a limiter to the level below that. Let me explain that statement. So let's say you're this guy who runs 15 miles a week and you run vaguely hard, which means you run kind of in between, in zone 2, basically, right? So you're used to being somewhat uncomfortable and you think a run's not worthwhile unless it's uncomfortable. So one of the things I want to do is have you run a little faster than that. I don't really care if you even run very much. If you just run a little faster than that, all of a sudden you'll get faster, right? Because you take away that limiter of a little higher intensity. A simple way to think about this might be if I could run 400 meters in a minute and I could run 100 meters in, say, 17 seconds, if I can increase my 100 meter speed to 16 seconds, I don't have to do anything other than that, and my 400 meter run time will get faster. It'll now be 57, 58. Because how fast I can run 100 meters, that rate of power is still limiting to anything downstream from it. So to put it into your world, if I also go out and train my squat strength and bring that up, I'll now be able to run 100 meters instead of 17 and 16 without even training to do that, just because I'm stronger. And that'll allow me to run my 400 meters faster, and that'll extend all the way out to, say, an ultramarathon, right? So if I take it even further and I say, okay, I'm not that interested in just my squat strength. I want to see my squat power go up. So I bring that up to, I don't know, 1,800 watts or whatever it is, right, by doing some jump squats, which I've never done before with lighter weight, and I push my power way higher than I can get it, say, using a 5RM type of set. Now I'll be able to run a little faster at each of those successes, because each thing is limiting to the downstream thing that's at a lower power output. So what's interesting is, depending on what you do, the stuff that's way out there at the lower power output also feeds back positively to do this. And here's the way to understand that. Let's say I'm a 100-meter runner and I run this 17 seconds, I'm just mediocre. And my way of training for that is I go out and I run like 6 by 100, right? And I do that, I don't know, once or twice a week, right? So that's all I do. I don't do any other running. So if I go out and actually build some of that lower power endurance, right? Maybe I start running a little bit of easy endurance running. Before you know it, I start being able to do those 6 by 100s more easily. I respond to them better. Now, I don't want to go too far with that, right? I don't want to become an ultra distance runner, because that'll start to negatively impede my ability to keep getting more power. But I do have to have enough endurance to support, or enough training tolerance to support me doing the training that I need to do that's most specific. So, both ends sort of feed back on each other. The real limiters, though, are the high power, right? Like, you could take any ultra distance athlete out there who's never done any strength work and give them just a little bit of strength work, and then all of a sudden they can run 400 meters a little faster, and then they'll be running faster in their ultra endurance event without changing how much they run or how much they run aerobically, right? And so the fact that those are all interrelated and understanding how to load all those successfully, that's what I call complex training, right? It's complex because it's involved. You have to hit a complex of, also another way to say it is, you have to hit a complex of different training intensities. So one of the things I like about that the best, from my own perspective, because I've been doing this for 30 years, is that it's also way more interesting. When I go out and just run for 15 minutes, that's not very interesting. Even worse, if I do that on a treadmill, it's not very interesting. But if I have to go and do all these elements, this specific warm-up, this specific end-stage warm-up stuff, the specific lead-in set, and then a very specific set, and then some specific work maybe aerobically afterward, where I have to keep changing things, even a treadmill gets interesting to run on because it engages your brain.
Give us an example of that.
Sure. I mean,
let's say one session.
So then my workout might be something like, I'm going to go 4 minutes at this pace, 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 what I call a progressive warm-up. And then when I finish that, I'm going to do some alactates, right? Some faster running that's ultimately going to build to be faster than the main sets I'm doing. So then I might be going like 4 by, in my case at this point now, it might be like 7.5 miles per hour, 8 miles per hour, 8.5 miles per hour, 9 miles per hour. I only get on there and go for 30 seconds, right? And then I get off, let the treadmill run, and reset the speed. So we call those strides in running sometimes. I just refer to them generically as alactates. I'm going fast. I'm not going all out. I'm just building, I'm increasing the ability of my nervous system to be prepared for the harder work. And the fascinating thing about that is that it potentiates the harder work, meaning that after you've done that little bit of higher neural input work, the harder work to follow feels easier. So then I'll go into the set. So if it's, say, the day that I'm going to work on my 1600 meter speed, my 800 meter speed, my 400 meter speed, I'll have 4 by something that represents that, like the equivalent of 4 by 400, maybe 4 by a minute or minute and a half or 2 minutes. And I'll progress those from the fastest, I'll do the fastest thing first, down to the slowest. So I typically would do the 400 meter speed first. That'd be like 4 by 20 seconds. And then I would do 4 by 40 seconds. And then I would do, say, 4 by anywhere from a minute 20 to 2 minutes, right? I'm getting really slow, so my mile pace stuff is like really slow now. And each progression makes the next progression easier. And the idea I call the rule of 4s is that I'm breaking my current ability to run that distance down into at least 4 parts, so that when I intervalize it, I can run that and it's fairly comfortable. I'm moving fast. My nervous system is reacting to that, but it's still fairly comfortable. So then I would go maybe into some sort of aerobic work. I oftentimes like to do weighted aerobic work on a treadmill, meaning I put a weight vest on. You've probably seen me doing that. And that's what we call strength endurance training. So I might have that, but even within that, I won't just try to run for 20 minutes at a fixed speed. I'll keep the power the same, but keep manipulating the grades and the speeds just again to engage, maybe even to introduce the idea of some specificity to whatever I'm training for at the time. And, so that whole workout, I have to like constantly focus on what I'm doing. So I get the advantage that it's a complex training approach. I'm hitting 4 different intensities that are limiters to me, but also that I'm having to engage my brain in terms of structuring the workout. So some people think that the way you deal with training is by making it disassociative. I watch a movie or something. The better way to deal with training is to make it associative, to make it a thing where you think about what you're doing, right? Where you have a plan and you're trying to follow it, and you're trying to hit the right powers at the right time for the right amount, and you're looking at how you're recovering and all those kinds of things. Not to think that you should overthink your technique, although sometimes when you're trying to transition your technique, you should even think about that, but that you should think about your workout, right? Am I doing this correctly, right? Am I getting the feedback that says this is going, this is adaptive, I'm going to be able to progress it a little bit? Like I might get on there and say, run the first effort in a, say, 4 by 2 minute efforts on the treadmill. By the way, in between there will be a recovery at walk pace typically, because I'm so slow that I can't recover anymore jogging. And I'll be thinking about the idea of whether or not that recovery looks better. Can I actually progress this compared to maybe the last time I did it? And I typically don't do a session, any more than 3 weeks apart. Most people are thinking you got to do it every week. You can't make any progress. Human body can progress from sessions done properly even 3 and 4 weeks later, right? So I'm looking to see if, in fact, I've progressed. Is my heart rate dropping better? Can I actually increase this work a little bit? So that every single training session, ideally, I'm making some progression because I've spaced them out. It takes a lot of patience to do that, but I look at training as life, right? It's not like I'm trying to get ready for this race in 6 weeks. It's more like I'm trying to progress my body back to some level that I'd like to reach over the next 6 months, right?
I want to step back a little bit because you mentioned about, if you work on your speed a little bit, your endurance is going to get better. We have a few athletes here actually like training for 70.3. We have 2 training for a 100-miler. There's one actually who went to Worlds at one point. They're diehard CrossFitters, but they're also training for endurance events. At what point will CrossFit affect their performance in endurance?
It kind of depends on where they're at, right? So I think of functionality more about the idea of being able to do then the movements of most interest to you. So for them at that point, it's triathlon, swimming, cycling, running. That's what's of interest to them. Do they have the functional ability to do that without injury and to the max of their capability? We talk about those 2 things. There's fairly clear-cut information around what's called the functional movement screen, which is just a way to assess functional movement ability that's more systematic. There are a lot of ways you can assess functional movement. I'm not criticizing that at all. I think lots of people do this more through their own approach, but at least there's one systematic approach, right? So that information makes it very clear that if you're functionally impaired, your likelihood of injury goes up. What's always seemingly not been the case is the idea that if you're functionally impaired, it has no relationship to your performance, but that was just bad research. Right? The original studies on that all took collegiate athletic programs, like my softball team, for instance, and then tested their FMS scores and tested the short power, typical athleticism that we test. How fast can I run a 40 or 60? How high can I jump? Things like that. how much power can I produce in, say, a squat, and found very poor relationships. So everyone sort of concluded that movement ability has nothing to do with performance. So that's completely wrong, because the models, the research was badly done. So we're still the only study that I'm aware of to do this properly, where we took a group of people who we knew would have low functional movement ability, recreational runners who are horrendous, right? Because running destroys your movement ability if you always do it slow. And even when you do it fast sometimes, like even elite runners sometimes have pretty bad functional movement ability. And so we knew the population would have poor movement ability, control treatment randomized, and then what we did was try to improve the movement ability of the treatment group, and the control, we just had them continue to train normally. And what we were able to show is that their mile running time, without training anymore, without doing anything that should have stimulated better performance through training, we held their training constant, their mile running time improved as their functional movement ability improved, whereas in the control group that didn't happen, right? So it's not just injury prevention, it's also performance if you're deficient in functional movement. It's not a main thing that determines your performance, but it can put a drag on your performance. So who's deficient? Well, hell, almost everybody. Right now, I know there's some personal experience. When we did the study, I had a couple of students who were very capable, so we started doing this with our football program, and you know our football program's good. And the guy who was running our strength and conditioning at the time was a good friend of mine, and he was open to this idea. So we started testing the freshmen, and like half of them had these deficient FMS scores where we really needed to work with them for a while before they even started doing. And these are supposedly the supremely athletic guys, right, that we have, right? So that's still true, right? A lot of our football players are still, and all of our athletes are still functionally sort of not there, right? And it's not hard to understand. They sit like everybody else the rest of the time, right? You just can't overcome that easily. So what I would be doing, or in trying to answer your questions, I would be looking at that. In triathletes, nobody ever looks at that, right? There's nothing published in that way. I don't hear anybody talking about it, but I would be doing that if I was to go back to coaching now. One of the tools I would use that I didn't use in those days, which I regret, right? One of the things that went wrong with Hunter is I never looked at his movement abilities, and his injuries had a lot to do with that. Had we understood better, he probably would have been less injured. I would look at their functional movement ability, and then I would try to improve it just the same way the NFL does, just the same way that the NBA does. I think MLB, it's weird there because they don't have consistent approaches to training, but just the same way probably that a lot of MLB players do, right? And then once we had established reasonable functional movement ability, then to me what you need to do in terms of figuring out the loading is figure out, the minimum, and this is always true in triathletes, the minimum amount you need to really load that functionality to maintain it, right? So if I do that, like in my case, I do that once a week, right? I have a load. I do every day, I do some functional movement, but only once a week do I do some loaded functional movement. I just can't afford to do more than that because I still like to run, and and the triathletes are all that way. They won't devote much time to this. So you have to figure out a way to do it with a minimum stimulus. So if you can get them there at first, then use the minimum stimulus. The other piece about weight training that I talk about that isn't part of what you guys do is that when you weight train an athlete who does a repetitive sport like swimming, cycling, running, you want to train the movement pattern itself. We call that specificity. You guys use specificity for the things that happen in CrossFit, but we don't oftentimes get that, right? Runners sometimes don't understand they're actually trying to train their running movement, right, with resistance. And so when you do that properly, you oftentimes create highly functional movements themselves. For instance, I like to do one-leg squats, ideally in a Smith machine, more recently with a belt because we don't have a Smith machine, as you know. I keep bugging Chris about that. Hopefully he'll listen to this. So I can load what actually happens in the dynamic of running, which is essentially that you land on the ground, everything flexes under load, right? And then you elastically respond from that. So that's why I do that weird exercise with a belt. You've probably seen me doing that, right? So that I can create strength in that specific movement pattern. But to do that in a one-leg stance is a highly functional kind of movement as well. So at that point, you're also training some functionality without it being pure maximum functionality like a snatch squat, right? I'm a big fan of the snatch squat as a way to really create a lot of functionality, a lot of ability to move the joints, although you don't get rotational movement, transverse plane movement, really. You need to have that as well. So, with triathletes, it's the minimum stimulus there, just to get them where they can move successfully, and then that drag is no longer holding them back from how fast they can run, how fast they can swim, how much they can cycle. The big thing with a triathlete is riding a bicycle properly in aero bar position and, actually destroys your functionality because the movement pattern is so narrowly transcribed and because we put our upper body into a very compromised position. So, overcoming that so it doesn't feed back into their running and swimming and inhibit their ability to do that is a huge piece of what we're trying to do with functionality.
Yeah, it's actually funny when you're just, talking about that because the lady who went to Worlds, she goes every year. I forgot her name. It's been a while.
Yeah.
But she told us like she could do 9-hour events, but she can't do overhead squats. Even lunges were hard.
So here's the way you might think about that. Let's say I'm a triathlete who does a 9-hour Ironman, which means I'm probably running somewhere around 3 hours for the marathon in that race. But I can only run a quarter in, say, track coaches, they talk about it as like 70. In swimming, we'd say it's 110. Hopefully you understand what I'm saying. So I can only run a quarter in 70 seconds. Well, if we enhance your functionality so you could now run a quarter in, say, 67 or 68 seconds, that 3-hour marathon is now like a 2:52, right? It's like a huge thing, right? So, they don't get that. They understand that the big bang for their buck is the aerobic training, right? Their ability to go faster and faster aerobically is the primary tool, but it's not the only tool is the problem, right? Sometimes they just sacrifice the other or don't even understand that those higher intensity things are still relevant or that they can train for those higher intensity things without creating undue fatigue if they intervalize it properly, right? If they understand how to actually train for that without making it too fatiguing. Most people don't. They think it's okay, you go to the track, you just go as hard as you can. Today, Clint, we're going to go 8x400 and I'm going to give you a couple minutes rest. You're just going to go out and run as hard as you can, right? That's not how you do it, right? That'll destroy you and impede your ability to adapt to all this aerobic work that makes you a good Ironman athlete. But ignoring it also gives you another limiter, right? And so, you find your way to a huge improvement just by doing more volume of endurance training, but you don't get anywhere near what you're capable of by just doing that. You look at these guys who, in my day, Dave was going, he went down around 8:07, I think. Mark Allen was down right around that. That was it. We thought that was crazy. Athletes are going 40 minutes faster than that now. And the only difference is they're faster. They're more functional, right? That's the only difference. They're not training harder, right? They're probably not training as hard. Dave was like overtrained all the time and just trained incredibly hard. But he didn't have good fun. We didn't understand it then, right? We were still so primitive in our understanding. I'd say the same thing about Hunter, right? I saw Hunter go through so many problems, which was because he wasn't very functional, right? Had we understood and done that properly, I think he would have been he was a very durable athlete, maybe the most durable athlete at his level in history, but he was still nowhere near as durable as he should have been, right? Because of that, in my estimation.
Yeah. Let's close this with a story. You told me one time that Lance Armstrong's mom came to you and she asked you to train him, and you said no?
It's kind of funny to me that I might actually put this in a public forum. So I have a friend, Jim Woodman. Jimmy and I were like freshmen together at Texas A&M playing water polo, right? He's just this arrogant dude and hilarious. Anyways, we've been friends our whole lives. So Jimmy, after we both transferred over to the U of A to try to keep playing at the U of A. And again, that didn't fulfill. So when he finished, he moved out to Austin. He put on a triathlon with nothing. He had no money at all. And then a group called President's Triathlon, President's Health Clubs, who I end up working for as well for a while. They had him recommended to take over their big race there. He put on something called President's Triathlon. For a couple of years, we were the big race in the world. Chicago would always be bigger, but it'd be later in the season. So we always had the distinction of being the biggest race. We had about 2,500 athletes at the peak, right? So in those days, that was very huge. So Jimmy and I are doing this race. I came out and helped him the first year because I was still in grad school, and he really didn't know how to do triathlons. I actually knew a lot more about it. He'll argue about that, of course. Dave Scott's dad was running the federation at that time. So I think it was the first year, maybe the second year. Dave Scott's dad, Vern, who used to swim with my mom in Masters, and for Dave up in Davis, he calls us and says, well, we didn't get an insurer to cover under 16s. So you have to remove all the kids under 16 who want to do your race. So I got a list of kids, right? So I got to be the one to call them because I'm nice. Jimmy's not nice. So which I hope he's nice now as an old man. So I call these kids up, and I get to this kid, Lance Armstrong. I don't know anything about this kid, right? I think he's 13 or 14 or 15. I can't remember now. But most kids, when you get them on the phone, they're like, "Can you talk to my mom?" You know? And I get this kid on the phone, and he's like, "You can't keep me out of that race. I've got 5 lawyers. I'm coming at." I always wonder if Lance remembers his call because he was pretty young, right? And I'm like, "Okay, whatever. You're gonna have to talk to Jimmy." So I can't tell some parts of it because some parts of it were unscrupulous. But let's say we worked out a way that he could race, which was, in retrospect, was not really acceptable. But let's just say it happened. So later on, I had put this ad together in one of the magazines we used to do. We actually did that too, around the health clubs, and having to do with coaching, blah blah blah. And so his mom comes up to me. He's about 15 at this point. And says, "Would you coach Lance?" And I was kind of a dumbass, I guess. I'm like, "Well, he's this kid. He was kind of a pain in the ass on the phone, and he does these races. In the early days, he would get way in front and then just fall apart, right, and like walk home. I'm talking when he's a little kid, right? Not a little kid, a teenager. So I'm like, I don't think so. I know I was pretty busy, right? I had this whole other piece of what I had to do." And I always look back at that and say, that was like the dumbest thing I ever did, because that's maybe one of the most talented kids in history. So, yeah, kind of funny. It's a small world, keeps going round and round and round, right?
Oh, yeah. Awesome. Hey, thanks, George, for coming.
Absolutely, Clint. I enjoyed it.
All right. See you at the gym.
Okay.